Hello, everybody, and good evening. I'm Pam Thomas, the coordinator for the Northern Virginia and the DC chapter of CHAD, and I want to welcome you to our September lecture, ADHD Across the Lifespan, presented by Dr. Katia Fredriksen and Dr. Jesse Brand. Many of you are familiar with CHAD and our chapter, but for those who are new, let me first say welcome. Our chapter's mission aligns with CHAD's national mission, which is to improve the lives of children and adults who are affected by ADHD. Our chapter is a volunteer organization of trained professionals who offer support to our ADHD community by providing free monthly lectures, offer support groups for parents and adults, and host an annual ADHD Awareness Month by a resource fair / lectures and so forth in October to highlight the ADHD Awareness Month. So to introduce our speakers tonight, Dr. Brand is a board certified clinical neurologist with wide-ranging expertise across various clinical populations, from young adults wondering about neurodivergence. Excuse me, I got something popped up on my screen. And hold on, something keeps popping up. Sorry. So Dr. Brand, from young adults wondering about neurodivergence to older adults concerned about dementia. He's dedicated to integrating research-based practice with an individualized approach to each of his clients, and his comprehensive assessments include grounded, compassionate, and insightful recommendations. Dr. Brand is committed to ensuring that clients feel supported and heard throughout the evaluations. Dr. Fredriksen is a pediatric neuropsychologist who specializes in comprehensive evaluations for children and adolescents who present with concerns related to learning, attention, behavior, and or socio-emotional functioning. In addition to giving lectures to parents, teachers, and other clinicians, Dr. Fredriksen is the co-author, along with Dr. Yael Rothman, of the Different Thinkers series, which is designed to teach elementary age children about their diagnoses. So welcome to our lecture tonight. We ask that you all type questions in the chat during the lecture, and one of our board members will be moderating the Q&A portion at the end of the lecture. So please keep your mics off and your screens off. And we welcome Dr. Brand and Dr. Fredriksen for sharing their expertise on this topic.
Thank you so much for having us. It's a real pleasure to be here. Dr. Brand and I are neuropsychologists. We work at the Stixrud Group in Silver Spring. We also have an office in McLean where we both see clients across the lifespan, as the name of this talk implies, from child to adolescent to adult. And we are pleased to be here to present to you tonight. I am sharing my screen now. You can see all my nice tabs I have open. There we are. I am going to start speaking, and we'll start from the beginning, right? So I work with children and adolescents, and Dr. Brand works with adults. So I'll start, and then we'll transition to him. Can you see the little pictures down this? Hold on, let me see if I can. Do they go away? Oh, darn it. Don't pause my screen sharing. Come back. Hold on, I've had a moment of technological where's he got? Technological lunacy. Jesse, help me. What am I doing?
I'm not sure.
I'm not either. My just screen share. Oh, wait, hold on. Is that it? Oh my God.
The green button at the bottom, share.
I know, but I open it and then it's still gone.
Oh no.
Where is it? Okay, well, I was doing very well here. Very temporarily. Show meeting.
We could see the slide before, if that helps.
I know. I don't know what I've done here. Well, I can admit Melissa while I sit here, sort of trying to figure out what I've done. I might just restart. keep everybody entertained while I try to figure this out. Oh wait, ha! Magic. There we are. That's what I was trying to do. I was trying to get rid of the pictures down the side. All right, can you see me now?
We see you, but I
Not the
still see
screen.
something called reports. Yeah.
There we go. Ha!
Ah, there we go. Okay.
Well, on that slightly turbulent note, why don't we begin? So we'll just start off by discussing, darn it, what ADHD is in general. I know that we have a variety of attendees. We have a combination of parents and professionals. And so I just want to be sure we cover the basics, right? So when we are assessing for ADHD, there are three things we are looking for. We are looking for some combination of difficulty regulating attention, impulses, and a person's activity level, sort of physical restlessness. All right. And that will look different for every person. We have to see these traits in multiple environments. In other words, we need to hear these traits, thinking, as I work with children and adolescents, thinking of that population, we need to hear about these traits at school and or at home and or at sports practice and or at church, in multiple environments in which the child spends regular time. Okay. There are subtypes of ADHD that we diagnose. There is the predominantly inattentive presentation, which refers to people who have the predominant difficulties with focusing and sustaining attention and sort of staying on task, daydreaming, traits of that nature. There's predominantly hyperactive impulsive presentation, which honestly, I think I've only diagnosed once. I think it's much less common. And then there's a combined presentation, which includes all of the above. Okay. So ADHD is one of the most common behavioral disorders in children. Boys diagnosed 2 times as often as girls, although as we'll discuss a little bit, girls are likely underdiagnosed. Like many medical, developmental, psychiatric conditions, research historically has, not these days, but historically was done primarily in males and predominantly white males. And so the diagnostic criteria much more closely mirrored a stereotypical male presentation with more of an emphasis on the hyperactive impulsive elements. On average, not in all cases, but on average, girls are more likely to present, more likely than boys to present with a predominantly inattentive presentation. And so based on the way the diagnosis has historically been conceptualized, they were more likely to be missed. And so hence why we have been devoting, more research to this issue in recent decades, and girls, diagnosis in girls has become, is catching up, but still there are many girls being missed. So the fact that 2 times as many boys are being diagnosed as girls doesn't mean that that is actually in fact occurring 2 times as often in the male population. ADHD very often runs in families. Kids with a first-degree relative are 6 to 8 times more likely to have ADHD. Very often when I do an evaluation, a parent will recognize traits. As we discuss them, and the child will recognize, oh gosh, so, my upbringing was very similar. These are sorts of similar things that I dealt with, etc. Something important that I always discuss with families is the idea that attention, ADHD, this whole idea of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that deficit word is a real misnomer. It's misleading because we're not referring to inability to attend. We're referring to difficulty regulating attention, such that people with ADHD are typically great at staying focused, persisting, etc. when they're engaged in activities that they enjoy, they find stimulating, they're in their wheelhouse. On the flip side, if we're looking at activities that are perceived as dull, perceived as stressful, overly challenging, then it is much more difficult to implement those same skills. Okay, hence from this arises the misconception we often hear, oh, my son/daughter can't have ADHD because he or she loves to spend hours reading or playing video games or whatever it is. And in fact, that's a cornerstone of ADHD, is that ability to really focus, hone in on something that the child really enjoys. Okay, and you might not see that same degree of engagement on an academic task or chores or whatever it is. No talk on ADHD is complete without discussing the strengths associated with ADHD, which are abundant and which we've learned more about in recent decades. Again, moving away from a historically, a more historical sort of medical model that focuses on disability, negatives, etc. We've become much better, more rounded in the way we look at all kinds of different conditions, ADHD among them. And there's been a lot more research on strengths commonly associated with ADHD and with other, autism, dyslexia, etc. So that ability to focus in on preferred topics that I was just alluding to is can be a wonderful strength. It can be a social conduit. It can support a person's studies, their career choices. People with ADHD are known to have, in general, higher sort of propensity for creative thinking, sort of spontaneity, willingness to take risks. There are many entrepreneurs who speak about their ADHD and how it has fueled their progress. So many strengths in addition to the areas that can sometimes make certain things related to school, work, other responsibilities more difficult, right? So an associated term that we very often hear when we talk about or when we read about ADHD is executive functioning. And I'm just going to briefly discuss this as I say to parents and feedbacks, people have heard this term, but just to be sure we're all on the same page as we're thinking about it, okay? So executive functioning skills are the skills that we implement in order to accomplish a goal-directed activity. In other words, we're trying to accomplish a task, okay? Could be something as simple as folding the laundry, doing the grocery shopping. Here I'm foreshadowing the wonderful example I'm about to go into. Could be something as complex as doing our taxes, writing an essay. So it's skills that you implement in order to reach a goal, no matter how small or large, okay? And so those skills include the ability to focus and sustain attention on the work we're doing to achieve the goal, the ability to hold information in our working memory, to inhibit our impulses so that we can proceed with sort of quality in our output. We need to plan ahead. We have to have a strategy. We need to organize. Say it's an essay, for example. We are needing to, we have our structure, our paragraphs, etc. We need to think flexibly. Plan A is not working, so I need to move on to plan B. We have to monitor the quality of our output. So just to make this more concrete, I like the grocery store example, which is a classic example because it shows how we're implementing these skills all the time without even consciously thinking about it. So, for example, when I go to the grocery store, I need to plan ahead. I need a list. I mean, obviously, every now and then I'll wander in without my list, but in general, I'm going to have a more successful, efficient trip if I have a list, and I won't forget things. So I have to plan ahead. I have to be efficient. I have to plan my approach. I'm not going to get my cucumbers and then get my milk and then get my lettuce and then get my eggs, right? I'm going to do my produce. I'm going to do my dairy. I'm going to do my frozen foods, right? I have a plan, right? I try to inhibit, I'm not always successful. I try to inhibit my impulses at the grocery store. I am not like snarfing up too much of the cookies and the chocolate, etc. Although again, as I say, not always successful at this. I'm thinking flexibly. So my recipe for apple pie calls for Macintosh apples, but they are not available. What can I substitute, right? So just as an example, these are skills that we're using all the time in the most basic tasks we do on a daily basis. And so there's a lot of crossover, as you may have gathered from some of those things that I just mentioned. There's a lot of crossover between ADHD and executive functioning. If you think about it visually, I'm not a particularly visual person, but if you are a visual person and you think about it visually, think about a sort of a large circle or bubble that is executive functioning, and within it is a smaller circle or bubble which represents the traits associated with ADHD. So in other words, executive functioning skills are included in the ADHD criteria, the attention, the impulse control, etc. Right? And then there are and individuals with ADHD are at higher risk for just showing this broader panoply of executive functioning vulnerabilities. Some of the typical common ones we see include Difficulty following multi-step instructions. This is a classic one I hear a lot from parents and teachers. Difficulty navigating the daily routine. The daily routine, the morning routine, the evening routine, it's always the same, but you know, so-and-so comes downstairs without their socks or without their just difficulty just navigating those tasks that are seem to parents to be very simple and straightforward. A tendency to misplace belongings. Difficulty managing materials. Like, oh gosh, a classic one that's so frustrating for students and families is I've done my homework, but then I forget to turn it in, right? Or I get home and I realize I don't have the materials I need from school to do my homework, and suddenly it's this enormous stressful experience at home. Difficulty managing one's workload, sort of planning ahead in order to accomplish tasks within their deadlines. Difficulty managing, in particular, academic tasks that have more of that planning and organizational demand. So writing, for example, comes to mind. Writing is very heavily dependent on your ability to plan, to organize, to appreciate the big picture, to see how everything comes together, right? Which are elements of executive functioning. And just this proneness we often see in ADHD to this more sort of inattentive errors, right? We often see it in math, we see it in spelling. Okay. So a lot of crossover there. Now, it's interesting as we think about executive functions to consider the trajectory of development. Now, as with everything else in life, these do develop at a different pace in different people. Okay, that said, there are general sort of guidelines, and you can see in this image here how we've got our red-yellow portions are less mature. We've got our blue-purple on the right, and so we're tracking from our 5-year-old to our preteen to our teen to our 20-year-old. And so what's interesting about this, of course, is that you see that 20-year-old brain is not all blue and purple. So we know that executive functioning skills are not fully developed until the mid to late 20s. And I swear each time they look at this, it seems to get later. So this, many of the children and adolescents who I work with, they still have plenty of time to grow and develop just naturally in regard to these skills. Okay, and it fits in with that truism people say, you know, the kid they send off to college is very different from the kid they get back. There is so much developmental maturation still going on neurologically in those years and beyond. Okay. So surges in development of executive functioning map onto natural increases in academic demand. So we see a surge around that kindergarten, sort of first grade type threshold. We see a surge in mid to later elementary school. We see a surge in mid to late adolescence, right? Just when kids are navigating the transition to elementary school, the upcoming transition to middle school, the transition to post-secondary. And that's when we see those surges. Now, there are things that we can do to support executive functioning development. There are aspects of the environment that can support executive functioning development. So one thing that as parents, teachers, other people who work or have relationships with children, one thing we can do is we can provide consistent, reliable, positive relationships. We can support children's efforts as they seek independence and work toward competence. We can model skills. We can help them practice. We can let them be creative and explore. And we can, again, as I say, support those gradual steps toward independence. Toxic stress or chronic stress, including economic, social instability, is a risk factor in terms of executive functioning skill development, as is inadequate sleep, exercise, nutrition. Okay, so certainly environmental factors that many people have control over, not everyone, but many people. Genetics plays a role. So, you know, as we were saying, ADHD, for example, runs in families often. And neurodevelopmental disorders. So people with ADHD, autistic people, people with learning disorders tend to are more vulnerable to executive functioning vulnerabilities. Okay, I had a supervisor when I was doing my postdoctoral training who said if you have a client with executive functioning vulnerabilities, it's like going into your primary care and saying you have a fever. It's not diagnostic because it can be associated with so many different things. Okay, so I came across this not too long ago, and I think it's a useful chart, especially again, as someone who works with children and teenagers and who's often talking to parents about how to understand and support their kids' executive functioning development. Russell Barkley is a very famous clinician who's done a lot of research on ADHD and very well known. And he has, by the way, wonderful videos on YouTube explaining lots of different things. related to ADHD. Anyway, so he's developed this 30% rule, which is, of course, a rule of thumb. I mean, nothing's exact, right? But so this gives you an idea. In a child with ADHD, his research suggests that the executive functioning skill development is 30% behind where you might expect it to be based on their chronological age. And so here's our little chart. So for example, you see on the top left line, if somebody is 5, that means that their executive functioning ability might be more on par with a 3.5-year-old, etc. And you can sort of move along here. So oftentimes, you know, again, the clinical relevance of this is I'll often have a family that's surprised or confused or just frankly baffled about how an older sibling may seem to be behind a younger sibling in terms of executive functioning skill development. And it's useful to sort of just say, hey, well, you know, based on so-and-so's ADHD, it's likely that they may be functioning for all intents and purposes on the same level as younger sibling in terms of their executive skill development or even lower. Okay, and so that's a useful thing for parents to understand because it helps with the whole, is this a can't do situation or a won't do situation? Is the child refusing to do this, or are they genuinely struggling with it? And in many cases, in the context of ADHD, I would argue, sight unseen, that there's a genuine difficulty behind whatever the parent is seeing. So to do due diligence and talking a little bit about adolescents as well, that's a whole nother, and in some respects, it's a whole nother sort of ball of wax, simply because there are so many other variables at play in adolescence that affect the child's presentation and ability to sort of navigate through the stages or the steps that are expected of them. And I find a useful framework to be an old-fashioned, but I think still valuable perspective on development. There's a well-known psychologist called Erik Erikson from and in the mid-1900s, he put out, which I know sounds like ages ago, but of course it's not that long ago. He put out his theory about developmental stages across the different age ranges. And I find and I think all of them, for each step, it's compelling, but the adolescent one really jumps out at me. I thought he really hit the nail on the head there. This idea of what the adolescent is striving for, on average, everybody's different, but is identity versus he always in his stages would have, here's what they're striving for versus here's the risk that they face if they don't achieve it, kind of thing. So for adolescents, it's identity versus role confusion. And so as we know, anybody who is / has raised a teenager or worked with a teenager as a teacher, clinician, whatever, we know that kids are really trying to figure out who they are and what they want to be and what they want to do. And they are seeking independence. They are naturally, developmentally cleaving away from parents and toward peers, and that's what we expect and hope for. It can be sad as a parent, but it's what we expect and hope for, because that's the natural course of progression that allows them to achieve that independence. And so the skills that we've just been talking about associated with executive functioning clearly have an effect on the child's capacity to navigate those steps needed to achieve greater independence with success, right? There are additional risk factors that adolescents with ADHD face that can make that achievement of successful independence more difficult. They are at higher risk of excessive social media use because of that. We talked about how people with ADHD can really focus in very strongly when they're interested in something, and that can be a great strength, but it can also be problematic if the thing they're interested in is TikTok or whatever, and they're spending ages doing that at the expense of other more productive, healthy activities. Teenagers, especially unmedicated teenagers with ADHD, are at higher risk for substance use and also for mental health issues. So there are other, it's just ADHD adds a layer of complication to this phase. That said, I mean, I don't like to leave adolescence on a negative note because it's a time of enormous progress and change. And, you know, we've been saying that executive functioning skills, the frontal lobe is still developing well through our mid to late 20s. The teen brain is still very adaptable, very resilient, can readily learn, adapt, change, And so there's still a lot of room for growth, even though it can be a tough time, especially for kids with ADHD. So just a couple thoughts about interventions before I hand it on to Jessie. Excuse me, Dr. Brand. So I'd like to speak about parenting, about outside interventions, and about school. So in regard to parenting, these are things I very commonly recommend for parents. These are things I bear in mind at home for my own child who has ADHD. Um, so if you are someone who is internally just has a lower degree of ability to regulate yourself, right? You have relative difficulty for someone of your age with self-regulation, then it stands to reason it can be beneficial to have a higher degree of external regulation. So in other words, external support to organize yourself, right? And so how we can achieve that as parents is that we can we can run a household that that offers a higher level of structure, regular routine, predictable, sort of consistent ways of navigating through the day. Does each and every day have to be identical? Of course not. We're not robots, and but the idea of having a fairly regular routine. We get up at a consistent time. We go to school. We have a fairly regular afternoon routine. We have dinner around approximately the same time. We go to bed around approximately the same time. That sort of thing. Okay. We can support our child's ability to navigate through that routine using visuals. We can put a piece of paper that if we're feeling fancy, we laminate with the steps of the daily routines, evening routine, wash face, pajamas, bathroom, read, whatever it is, depending on the age of the child. We can have a list of backpack contents right by the door as the kid's going out. Have you packed your iPad, lunchbox, whatever it is that is required for the school? We can have a family calendar. We can have one of those big ones with the that allow you to map out the whole month, such that we can map out what's coming up. And so then kids, it helps them think about planning, looking ahead, etc. Oh, it's only 2 weeks until so and so's birthday. I'll have to start thinking next week about their gift, and it just instills that habit of planning, right? We can help break down larger tasks. Instead of go and clean your room, we can have a list of steps of what that entails. Put away books, make bed, put stuffies in bed, etc. We can support health behaviors. We know that sleep is critical for attention, memory, learning. There are recommended amounts of sleep for different ages in childhood and adolescence, which you can easily look up online. My kids are elementary through middle school age is the sort of the 9 to 11 hour range is what's recommended. Everybody's an individual, sure, but this gives you a rule of thumb. We want to maintain good sleep hygiene, no screens in the bedroom overnight, no screen time for an hour before bed, no caffeine in the afternoon. We want to encourage regular exercise. That doesn't need to mean a structured team sport or like we're dragging them off to swimming at 4 a.m. No, I mean going for a walk, jumping on a trampoline. There's all kinds of ways that we can get physical exercise. We want to attend to the gut-brain axis. There's research on the benefits of certain kinds of diet in terms of supporting brain health. For social media, which I alluded to before, I have a talk on this for parents that I've done, and so I distilled it into just a few quick points, which is avoiding essentially for as long as possible, developing a contract within the family as to what's acceptable and what's not, creating phone-free spaces and hours and modeling that, right? If we're on our phones all the time on Facebook or Instagram, whatever we're doing, we're really not, we can't really expect kids to be super respectful when we try to limit them. And then keeping an eye on things, monitoring. I already mentioned can't versus won't. Interventions outside the home. First tier empirically supported intervention for ADHD is medication. Typically stimulant medication can make a world of difference. Sometimes takes some trial and error. Other things I recommend that families consider are, depending on the age of the child, hiring an executive coach to help instill those planning and organizational time management strategies. Just the time when kids often need that support, middle school, high school, is when they're less willing to accept it from a parent because of that natural search for individuation. And so it can help to outsource that. Some of the parenting strategies that I recommended, it can be helpful to work with a parent coach if you're having trouble implementing them or you need someone to troubleshoot with. You can also consider, if your child is available and interested, psychotherapy for your child to develop coping strategies, routines, etc. At school, we always discuss with parents what would be helpful to support your child's learning, engagement, happiness during they're at school for a long time. How can we make this experience as rewarding and pleasant and productive as possible? There are different sorts of plans that we can request based on your child's needs. We can request accommodations in the classroom, which can be incredibly basic, but also incredibly helpful when it comes to supporting the child's attention and making the school day a more pleasant experience for them, attending to where they sit, ensuring that they get the opportunity to move around, to take motor breaks, etc. All kinds of things that we can recommend that can make life easier and that is really not that difficult to implement. We can recommend, if the child's ADHD is impacting their learning, we can recommend services or interventions in that regard. And there's plenty of research out there on homework strategies designed to make the homework process more efficient. Okay, and that's a whole talk in and of itself, I'll tell you that. And then the last thing I wanted to mention before I give Jesse his turn is, and this naturally progresses into adulthood, so I feel that I planned this quite well, is the launch to college. Right. So not to be an alarmist, but the fact of the matter is that students with ADHD have been found to have lower levels of college readiness. In other words, having developed those skills for successful, sustained independence that we've discussed during the course of this evening. They are, on average, more likely to experience academic difficulties and require support at college, and overall, they have lower rates of degree attainment. So this is not meant to be fear-mongering. These are just facts, and there are ways that we can support to ensure that these things don't happen. So kids who are in a better place mental health-wise are less likely to exhibit these outcomes. Kids who are in a better place in terms of having learned executive functioning strategies are less likely to exhibit these outcomes. And kids who have had accommodations over time and who have sought out supports at college are at lower risk for these sorts of negative outcomes as well. So really supporting that mental health and executive functioning skill development and reaching out for the help and support that the child needs as a student. Okay, Jesse, I'm going to turn it over to you. Hopefully you'll be more successful with your screen share.
I was just going to say, I hope I have more luck with the tech.
I mean, you can't do worse than I did, so, I mean.
That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Let's see here.
Better late than never, right?
All right, that should work. Yes. And let me get rid of this. Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Fredriksen. Thank you so much to Chad for inviting us here, and for everybody for coming tonight, and to future people watching this video in the future. I just want to reiterate that I am a neuropsychologist, not a neurologist, for anybody that might have been confused. I think that word was used before. But that was such a great introduction to ADHD, especially obviously in kids. I learned some things and going through some of the basics. So I'm going to be talking more about ADHD specifically in adulthood, including some of the signs of ADHD specifically in adulthood, some strategies that one can use. I'll take you through how an assessment is done for an adult, some of the issues involved. As you can imagine, these issues can be quite different from assessment in children. I will try not to repeat much of what Dr. Fredriksen said, but there may be some common ideas. First, just a word about the prevalence of adult ADHD. It seems like the most heavily cited number is 2.5% of the population. But there's some other specific studies that show a slightly higher rate, higher prevalence. But in any case, estimates suggest that the number of adults with ADHD worldwide is in the hundreds of millions. And we still have that 2-to-1 ratio in terms of gender. So then in our humble abode in the DMV area, where there are 6.4 million people or so, that means there are at least roughly about 100,000 adults with ADHD walking around. You can check my math. I may not have that exactly right. I do about 50 evaluations a year where there's a question of ADHD, and I don't diagnose ADHD every time. So there's a lot of work to be done in the area. One of the most important things to note about adult ADHD is that there is no such thing as adult ADHD. It's all just ADHD. And one of the primary criteria for ADHD is that symptoms have to be present prior to age 12. It doesn't matter if you're 13 or 64 years old, you theoretically have to show signs in childhood. Also, conversely, just because you had ADHD as a child doesn't mean that you meet criteria forever. We saw those brains that Dr. Fredriksen showed. So around half or more than half of children outgrow their symptoms over time. So there are certain criteria that one has to meet in adulthood for an ADHD diagnosis. I won't go through those here. They are obviously the same as the ones in childhood, but the real crux, as Dr. Fredriksen was saying, is this sort of dysregulation of attention, an imbalance of attention. I sort of think of it as whereby one struggles to pay attention to things that are sort of less interesting, less engaging, but can hyper-focus on the things that they're interested in. So that persists into adulthood. And that's a little different from most people whose attentional system is more even across situations. People with ADHD tend to have big ideas, and adults with ADHD have big ideas. They can be very entrepreneurial. They say yes to things, but they also struggle to see projects and tasks through as well. There's often a sense of restlessness in adult ADHD, and it's that kind of hyperactivity in childhood that sort of retreats inwardly in adulthood and becomes this kind of sense of restlessness, which can further detract from being able to sustain attention, to finish things. So, some of the soft signs, what I call soft signs of adult ADHD, not the actual criteria, is in someone's history, you may see a bunch of job transitions, for example, whether they were let go or just got bored, decided they wanted to move on, try something else. There's often some degree of marital conflict or conflict in long-term relationships. People with ADHD often have more trouble meeting the demands that a marriage brings. And then, especially when ADHD is unrecognized in childhood, there can be decades of struggling with these issues. The repeated negative feedback, sense of not really meeting actual capability, deep sense of negative self-concept. So that's something I very often see in adult ADHD. There are many challenges to making the diagnosis in adulthood. One of the most formidable challenges is that just having attention problems as an adult doesn't mean that ADHD is the cause. And having attention problems as an adult is common. It's actually ubiquitous. Everyone has attention problems. We all have attention problems. It's part of being human. It's part of having a brain that runs on chemicals and electricity. And there are many conditions that cause attention to worsen too, that you see in adulthood: depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disease, sleep issues, alcohol use, recreational drug use. So the real key to diagnosis is how long have these problems been going on? Have they been lifelong since childhood? Okay, so simple, we can get that information, right? Well, adult clients don't always have clear memories of their childhood symptoms, or childhood at all, for that matter. We can ask parents, but try asking a 70-year-old parent about how their 40-year-old was like, 30 years ago, or how well they paid attention in their classroom, or how good their study habits were. And you'll find that most parents seem to think that everything was fine if things were generally mild. You can get school records if they're available, but many school records are pretty superficial. In large schools, especially, teachers may not notice when a kid is struggling. Some records are just limited to letter grades rather than comments. There may be a lot of informal accommodating. So that's another thing you can run across. Parents often structure their kids' study habits at home, fill time with sports and other activities to the point that the pressure is kind of already on when the kid gets home at night, and then the homework has to be done. Sometimes there's an older sibling who needed more supports, and comparatively, the client that you have in question seemed pretty typical. So anyway, all of this is to say that it's not so simple to establish criteria for ADHD in adulthood. It's up to the clinician to really get a sense of what was going on in childhood. If there weren't very many symptoms reported, are there reasons for that if ADHD is present? So here are some ways to be diagnosed with ADHD in adulthood. In order of accuracy from lowest to highest, in my perspective. You can take a test online that involves like a single questionnaire. You can tell a doctor that you're having attention problems, and depending on the doctor, you may wind up with an ADHD diagnosis. You can tell your psychiatrist your story, maybe take a questionnaire or two, have them diagnose ADHD in order to try a stimulant medication, see if that helps. You can work with a therapist who really gets to know you and your story, and they may diagnose ADHD. Or you can undergo a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation, which I think is the most accurate. I think most people do. And you can do more than one of these things. You can do all of these things. Many of my clients have. So I just want to tell you what's involved in the adult neuropsychological evaluation. The general process is you interview the client for about 1 to 2 hours. You'll do an interview with somebody who knows them really well, like usually a parent, but maybe a spouse if it's a slightly older person, even a good friend if no one else is available. We give a range of questionnaires getting at symptoms both currently and in childhood. We do the actual neuropsychological or cognitive testing to get a sense of present functioning. And we do an assessment of emotional functioning to help rule out any major emotional distress. And then, of course, we go over everything with the client and write up a lengthy report, which is the feedback. I thought it might be helpful and interesting and fun to take you through some examples of questionnaire results, specifically from a questionnaire I use called the CARS-2, which gets at current adult symptoms. So this is the first criterion of diagnosis. Are there current symptoms present? We get at that just by asking the client and asking somebody else to rate their symptoms. For each of the examples I'm going to show you, they were parents. You may not be able to see these well here, but this is a scale of inattention and executive dysfunction, hyperactivity, impulsivity, emotional dysregulation, negative self-concept, which is so associated with ADHD that they put it on the questionnaire, and then DSM-specific symptoms related to ADHD, and just a total index. So this kind of questionnaire helps us to address one of the primary issues in adult assessment, which is, again, that every adult has some degree of attention lapses. So we can put some numbers to those lapses and see just how pronounced they are compared to the general population. This first one, a young adult client who had a very clear history of ADHD symptoms throughout her life, never received a diagnosis. Mom was pretty much on board with that idea that she may have ADHD. And this is a good example of a case that's pretty much a slam dunk, consistent findings across reporters, with some discrepancies in the emotional dysregulation, negative self-concept. This is one I was really on the fence about because the client's ratings for themselves were pretty borderline. Parents didn't report anything significant except for, as you can see, emotional dysregulation, negative self-concept. And this is a good example of where context matters. The client had just graduated from college. They were living at home. They were looking for a job. There are very few demands in the client's cognitive functioning, so that has to be taken into account. And that's an example of the holistic nature of the neuropsych evaluation. The client was also very private, and parents acknowledged they actually knew very little about him, what was going on with him, even though they were under the same roof. And then finally, here's one with huge discrepancies between client and mother, which I see not uncommonly. This client was already living outside the home for a while. Mom had a lot of stressors in her own life that she was dealing with. So it made sense that the mom wouldn't necessarily notice the struggle that her daughter was having internally. So that's just some example of questionnaire results. Here are the things I measure with a cognitive battery. Each of these lines is really measured by 1 or 2 tests. So the entire battery takes about 2 hours. This is a more abbreviated evaluation, including the emotional functioning questionnaire. None of these tests are diagnostic. The diagnostic manual says nothing about scores on these tests, but they can help give us more information about the client and how they tick, and they can help support a diagnosis. And clearly, I want to draw your attention to the sustained attention measure, which is really the primary difficulty in ADHD. And this is measured by a continuous performance test, or CPT, which is essentially just a long, boring, tedious task. And you get to see how the client is able to, handle being bored and having to pay attention anyway. Do these work? Well, a recent review of CPTs in one of our best neuropsych journals, the Clinical Neuropsychologist, found that there's actually limited diagnostic utility for adults. And the findings aren't very consistent across studies. But the conclusion was that they can increase diagnostic accuracy when combined with all the other measures that we use. So the test itself can't tell you whether someone has ADHD or not, nor should you use it that way, because that's not what the diagnosis is based on, but it can help, so we do it. When we're done with all this testing, we get a distribution of scores, most of the scores usually in the average range, but we can see what scores are kind of lagging behind and what scores are strong. And when attention and executive functioning scores lag behind, say, intelligence scores, visuospatial scores, language scores, that can suggest ADHD. But again, this profile can be seen in a wide range of adult populations. It's not specific to ADHD, so you can't base an ADHD diagnosis on this alone. What else makes this complicated? Well, there are often incentives to seek an ADHD diagnosis, even when it's not accurate. This is, I think, particularly true for adults, not kids. A 2019 study showed that a substantial minority of adults, but a substantial one, being assessed for ADHD do exaggerate their problems. Some adults want to enhance their performance at work with a stimulant medication, which will give you a boost, whether you have ADHD or not. Some adults want academic accommodations at college or grad school, which will help whether you have ADHD or not. And understandably, some adults just want a label to help explain past and future life difficulties. And I get that, and that's an kind of intrinsic motivation, and they may actually believe that it's ADHD. So it's hard for us as providers. We want to help people. We don't want to dismiss concerns. We don't want any false negatives where there's actually ADHD. We say it doesn't look like it. Especially after what can be a lifetime of frustration and invalidation, maybe underachievement. But we also want to take self-reports with some degree of caution. We do have ways, we have controls in place to see if there is over-exaggeration in our questionnaires, in our testing. So we do try to look out for that. Some other issues in ADHD diagnosis in adulthood. ADHD is strongly associated with other psychiatric disorders, most commonly substance use disorder, mood disorder, depression, anxiety. Clearly, as you can see here, we don't have a very good grasp of the exact prevalence of these disorders in ADHD. But again, recall that these psychiatric disorders are also associated with the same cognitive difficulties seen in ADHD. So if someone comes in with a depressive disorder, they're often going to have problems with attention or executive functioning that are not attributable necessarily to ADHD. So on our questionnaires, these people may look like someone with ADHD. On testing, they may look like somebody with ADHD. Again, the key to differential diagnosis is the whole picture going all the way back to childhood. So I'm not trying to entirely devalue services like this. I love the idea of efficiency, cost effectiveness. I love the idea of taking a first step to self-exploration. But I think this just helps bring my point home that ADHD in adulthood is complicated. It's a complicated diagnosis to make and not necessarily conducive to an online test. A few more important points I want to make about our current conceptualization of adult ADHD. As Dr. Fredriksen mentioned, we believe ADHD looks differently in men versus women as we do for boys and girls. Women, again, are more likely to be inattentive than hyperactive and tend to be better at developing masking strategies. The use of strategies to hide who you really are can lead to self-esteem issues. Women with ADHD have more difficulty in relationships than their male counterparts. Anxiety can be more prominent in women with ADHD than men. And finally, women are often usually seen for a diagnosis other than ADHD and then later diagnosed with ADHD, not as true in men with ADHD. What about racial and ethnic disparities? Studies show that white young adults have higher rates of ADHD than racial and ethnic minorities. The reason for that is thought to be one, that whites are simply overdiagnosed, and two, minorities are underdiagnosed. And of course, there are a range of reasons for this, including stigma, mistrust of the medical community, linguistic, geographic, financial barriers. You could do a whole talk on just this slide. And then rounding out the lifespan, older adults with ADHD can show symptoms that are similar to those in younger people, but they don't often see the symptoms as being problematic as they were in the past. And for one, they've likely been highly practiced at their compensatory strategies over the course of decades, so they've learned to live with it. Old age often comes with a sense of acceptance. And I think, I haven't seen this in writing, but older adults often have fewer demands on their cognitive functioning, so they may not notice the symptoms as much as, say, if they're retired, if they're not raising kids. They have a wider range of conditions that can mimic ADHD. So, for example, many older adults have cerebrovascular changes that are relatively normal for their age. But can come up with the same symptoms as ADHD. whatever age-related cognitive changes there are can be more pronounced in people with ADHD. And doctors have to be a little more careful in prescribing medication for ADHD in older adults. But again, those positives, those strengths continue through older adulthood. Older adults with ADHD are essentially often more energetic and productive than those without. I know I'm running out of time a little bit here. I just want to say that just as in kids, stimulants are thought to be the first line of treatment for adult ADHD, followed by non-stimulants. There are, though, lower effect sizes of medication seen in adults than children. And there are, of course, non-pharmaceutical treatments available, psychotherapy, dietary change, cognitive coaching or executive skills coaching, and neurostimulation. And I'm getting a little outside of my wheelhouse here, but I've seen that there's ongoing research in how to best target medications for adult ADHD and how to achieve a longer duration of action. And since the COVID pandemic, we're getting more practice at delivering psychotherapeutic techniques digitally, like CBT, brief motivational interviewing, ACT, and researchers are developing better neurofeedback techniques to help people with ADHD. In terms of cognitive coaching, I very often recommend an executive skills coach, just like Dr. Fredriksen was saying about for kids, providers who help you implement certain systems and strategies for compensating for ADHD symptoms. Some of the strategies that a coach could help with are things like breaking down a larger problem into smaller pieces that are more manageable. This is something everybody kind of knows they should do and don't really always do it or don't know how to get started on it. It's easier said than done. Time management is another good strategy. For example, doing your most complex work at your best time of day, which for most people I think is the morning, saving more menial tasks for later in the day. For many people with ADHD, it's particularly important to take regular breaks while trying to sustain attention over time. Space management is important. It's helpful for people to work within their optimal settings, whether that's complete silence at home or almost silence at a library, the low drone of a coffee shop, even with all the energy around, having music on versus not. And it's also important for many people with ADHD to remember that we as humans are not good multitaskers. Our brains are literally unable to multitask. And when we think we're multitasking, we're actually just shifting our attention back and forth. So no one should really try to multitask, but people with ADHD may be particularly vulnerable to its impact. Of course, using some organizational tool like a calendar or productivity app can be helpful. I swear by mine. I often recommend to people with ADHD a standing or a walking desk, particularly if there are prominent hyperactive symptoms. And finally, can be helpful to work in the presence of somebody else who's also working. And there are actually websites where you can actually pull up somebody on your screen, somebody random, and just work side by side with them if you don't have easy access to a study buddy. But I just want to point out that these strategies have to be tailored to the specific person and specific setting. So working with a coach is important. And a neuropsych evaluation can help inform that as well. So just quickly, my take-home message is there is no adult ADHD. There is only ADHD in adulthood. We see common experiences in ADHD, the attentional imbalance, that's sort of the crux of it, trouble following through, the real world consequences to ADHD, like marital conflicts, job issues, but also the strengths, big ideas, entrepreneurship, and then the kind of negative self-concept that comes along with it. So a holistic, comprehensive assessment is most accurate for diagnosing it. And there are also a range of strategies to manage symptoms, and a coach can help you with them. And with that, I will thank you for your sustained attention. I put up both mine and Dr. Fredriksen's emails if you ever want to reach out, our number at the Stixrud Group. And I will stop sharing here.
Thank you both, Jesse and Dr. Brandon, Dr. Fredriksen. So this is Sally Namazi. We can get to the Q&A. There's a lot of really good questions coming up on the chat. I don't know if you were, hopefully you weren't getting distracted by them. No pun intended.
You actually can't see them when you're presenting, so
Yeah,
Good.
just
You're-
the number going up.
yeah, you just talk to yourself. It's very
Yeah.
strange, as a matter of fact.
I like that. Okay, so there was a question that came up somewhat early in the talk, and I don't know how you want to address this. What types of therapies work the best for ADHD?
And I mean, for adults, I believe, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, to get some of those maybe negative cognitions under wraps, behavioral techniques, acceptance and commitment therapy for better acceptance of oneself, kind of battling that negative self-concept. I mentioned brief motivational interviewing. That's also a popular one, but I think the general gist is a CBT.
Yeah, same in childhood, adolescence, and with the addition potentially of parent coaching to help, implement strategies at home that are productive.
Okay. And Dr. Brand, I wanted to actually ask you a question that didn't come up in the chat, but I think it'd be helpful to clarify. When you said you made a comment about stimulants and effect sizes, I think you said lower effect size. Can you just explain what that means?
Yes, good question. It just basically means that stimulants don't seem to have as positive an effect in adults as they do in childhood. So
Okay.
it's just less of an effect. I think there's maybe many reasons for that. I think things are maybe more complicated in adults' life, or they're taking other medications, for example. So there's just more complexities, I think, involved in adults.
Sure, that makes sense. There was a comment and question about general advice for a student or the parent of a student who is twice exceptional in college and beyond. It's pretty open-ended, so you can kind of go anywhere with that.
I'm not sure exactly what the question is.
Yeah, so there was a comment on how this individual they had trouble kind of sticking to a class themselves, and they kind of just dropped classes routinely.
Yes.
And how that has not served them well in the long term, and they're wondering about their own child, and just making sure, to equip their child with good tools, and anything you can comment on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's for twice exceptional, I think it's about harnessing strengths, what makes them exceptional, yeah, I think that's a pretty common story, but just making sure you're intervening with those more fundamental cognitive skills like sustained attention and response inhibition.
And I think it's important to be planful as your student is heading into college in that regard, right? Because I don't know if we still do, but certainly in years past, and Sally, you can correct me if it's still the case, we used to have a real uptake in January of students coming in who had been put on academic probation after their first semester at college because they had gone in without the needed supports, right? And they had had trouble keeping up with the requirements. And so being proactive in that regard, I think, can be very helpful and can head off at the pass the potential sort of devastating ego blow of that sort of experience, which can be so hard for a young person.
Yeah, I think that tracks. Someone asked about informal accommodations. I can't remember. I think maybe it was you, Dr. Fredriksen, who had mentioned that. Informal accommodations. Or was it you, Jesse? I
I think
can't.
I mentioned that looking back, that there may have been some informal accommodations made in childhood that you're just not remembering
Okay.
or not
So
aware of even. Yeah.
the
So
question,
parents, oh, go
well,
ahead.
the question was informal accommodations, are these helpful or limiting?
They are masking in a way, and that was really my point, is that if a student is able to go to a teacher and say, sorry, I just didn't finish it, I started last night and I couldn't get it done, and the teacher says, okay, we'll just hand it in tomorrow, it's no big deal, then a parent may not know that there are issues there, if the school is just kind of managing it under the radar, which is clearly helpful for the student in some ways, in the moment, but again, can mask the collection of data when, in 20 years, when we're trying to look back and say, did you have issues, back when you were in high school? Parents say no.
Well, and parents implement,
And
I don't
parents,
know if
yeah,
we'd call it informal accommodations, but they implement, parents are so often unaware of the degree of support that they're putting in place just because it's sort of the way they live their lives, right? It's
right.
interesting. I just did a feedback this morning where I diagnosed a child with ADHD, and the mother said that she also realized in adulthood that she had ADHD when she left home, right? Because she'd been brought up in a household where just culturally there was a lot of support. She said she never had to do her laundry or clean, or and so she grew up, and then suddenly she's on her own in an apartment having to pay her bills and clean her kitchen, and she was completely overwhelmed. And so that sort of thing too can conceal underlying vulnerability.
Yeah, and that's something I often see just seeing adults, is that things seem totally fine until college, when the guardrails kind of come off, and then it's a pretty big surprise often.
Yeah, I think that's a common story,
Mhm,
unfortunately.
mhm.
To piggyback off of that, there was a question about how a person should ask for accommodations in the workplace, like when
Yeah,
disclosure should happen, how should they? I know this is a very complicated, um,
yeah,
sticky topic.
yeah. It's a great question. It's one I get all the time. There's many things to think about. One, you know, um, do you want to disclose, right? You're going to have to disclose ADHD if you ask for accommodations. What's the culture of the workplace like? It's going to be different if you're working for, say, a nonprofit, maybe than if you're working for Department of Defense. And I've had those conversations before. Um, how much do you think accommodations will really help you? Do you have specific accommodations that are reasonable, that will do a lot of good on sort of balancing out the potential for stigmatization, which is unfortunate, versus the possible benefits? And so I often recommend clients to really think about it, talk to a therapist. Actually, most of my clients already do have therapists. So really try to suss it out, and talk to others as well to make that decision, because it's a tricky one.
Good advice.
Yeah.
There was a question, or there are a couple of questions actually, about apps that you all recommend for people with ADHD and issues with productivity.
Mhm.
Do you all have specifics you guys like to recommend?
There are some I like. I mean, it changes all the time, right? So with that in mind, and also some of mine are more sort of you know, pediatric oriented. But there are productivity apps that some people find helpful too that I've heard good things about. One is called Off Screen, and one is called Forest, as in the trees in the forest. Okay, Jesse, good. I'm seeing some
Yeah.
nonverbal support there. Right, and those enable you to shut off access to distracting sort of things for a period of
Yeah.
time while you work,
Yeah.
right? And there are good list apps, right? Like isn't Todoist. I've heard very good things about.
Todoist, yeah, I've heard good things. I swear by the app that I use personally, no conflict of interest, but it's called Things, and it's in its third edition, so it's called Things 3. I keep everything in there, so that's just my own personal experience, but I think it's great, and yeah.
So what do you do
recommend
with it? Like, what do you mean you keep everything in there?
Oh, I mean, every time somebody wants to tell me something, that I'm just standing there with no notes to take or anything, I'll just, take out my phone and put it. I know exactly where I'm putting it. I'm putting it in a certain section in this app, but the app allows you to sync with your calendar. So you have your whole calendar in there. It allows you to create projects. So speaking of, breaking down problems into smaller pieces, it allows you to do that kind of visually. It allows you to sort by day. It allows you to set alarms. I'm probably describing most of the productivity apps out there. I just happen to land on this one and like it. It also gives you that little vibration when you check a box that says you finished, and that gives you a little stimulation. It feels good.
I bet that feels
Positive reinforcement.
satisfying. That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a great app.
Do you all have any data or know any data about coffee for kids or adults with ADHD?
Oh, that's interesting. I
Yeah,
don't,
it's an
because I
interesting
just don't,
question.
I tend to not think of coffee for children in general, but what about you, Jesse?
What I have heard is that it may feel it is technically a stimulant, but it's not the same kind of stimulant as a medication. I think it works slightly differently, and I've recently learned that coffee doesn't actually give you any extra energy or anything. It just makes you feel less tired, even though you still are. So it kind of just masks or puts a band-aid on your tiredness. I think it works differently from actual medications that you would be prescribed. That being said, I think a lot of people with ADHD that is maybe unrecognized rely on coffee, at least in the morning, to help get them going. So I don't think it's a terrible thing. I drink coffee, but some people do use it too much, obviously, as you can imagine. Then it affects sleep.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to piggyback off that, it's not like we tell people not to drink coffee before testing.
Right.
It doesn't, I don't think, affect attention to that degree.
Right.
Back to that app you were talking about, Dr. Brand, someone wanted to confirm the name of it.
Things,
Just the
just
word
like the
things.
word things, and
Okay.
it's Things 3. They may have a 4. I don't know.
Okay.
I should look into that.
Makes me think
There-
of thing 1 and 2.
I know, right? There was a question, this is a really good question, on data with ADHD and dementia.
Yeah.
Is there an increase in dementia?
I think there is some research linking those two, but I think it's sort of mixed. And I think I see the question right now. It says not as much as there should be. I think that's true. I think we don't have clear data on that. So I'm not aware of a very strong link, but I think I've seen studies that start to show that.
Okay. There was a question about ADHD and the overlap with other neurodivergence conditions like autism.
Well, there's among autistic people, there's a higher rate of ADHD than in the typical population. And so those two things very often co-occur and overlap in certain ways in childhood and adolescence. We also see a higher proportion of learning disorders in students with ADHD, sort of for the reasons we discussed in terms of the difficulty focusing and persisting with things that are perceived as more difficult or stressful, right? We see higher rates of anxiety, depressed mood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the overlap and the co-occurrence of ADHD and autism in adulthood is definitely a complicating factor. And of course, you can have both. But it can get tricky.
Yeah, the fact of the matter is that in the previous iteration of our diagnostic manual, which was phased out in 2013, if you diagnosed autism, you weren't even allowed to diagnose ADHD simultaneously because it was considered to be such an obvious accompaniment.
Mm.
And then, so just speaks to the degree of overlap in the autistic population. And they phased that out when they updated the manual, I think, because, you know, ADHD deserves its own recognition. But so just to speak to that degree of overlap. Mm.
And then they removed that, obviously, but yeah, I remember when that was.
Yeah, 2013, they removed it.
I don't know if you guys know this data, but there was a question about the base rate of ADHD in the US and in the world.
Mm.
If you know that. It's a hard question.
Gosh, I don't know off the top of my head.
I don't know either. Sorry.
No, no. Did you, so
Yeah.
someone asked about cognitive coaching.
Mhm.
What is cognitive coaching?
I was using cognitive coaching as sort of shorthand. I think of them as executive skills coaches or even
Executive
ADHD
functioning coaching?
coaches. Yeah.
Okay.
But again, those are people, maybe some are on this call who follow clients from week to week, and they help them put in place strategies, systems for compensating for not just ADHD, but any condition that affects cognition. So I almost invariably recommend it.
Mm-hmm. I'm with
Well,
you.
yeah, the fact is, I mean, these are skills that we expect students to develop just out of, you know, not out of thin air, but naturally,
Mhm.
right? And they're not explicitly targeted in many schools. And that's not always the case. So some of us were the person who had their color-coded binders and notes, and it just naturally sort of came into place with good fortune. But for many people, it doesn't. And so I very often recommend considering that for middle school, high school, when people are sort of having real difficulty navigating the multiple demands, especially in the sort of area where we live, where so many kids are involved in lots of extracurriculars as well. So.
There was a comment about the role of microplastics in ADHD. Do you all have knowledge about that? Someone said they read an article in the Washington Post about it.
I don't, but I'm fascinated. Yeah, I don't, but I'm fascinated. We'll have to read that. I see that post.
Yeah, she linked the
Yeah,
article.
thanks for sharing.
Interesting. There's a question about book recommendations on ADHD for children and adults. Like, what are your go-tos? I have a few I can share too.
Well, at the risk of tooting one's own horn.
Right? How can you
You have to
recommend
toot your, I was gonna
anything
say
else?
your book.
Who else is going to do it, right?
I was gonna do it for
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. At the risk of tooting one's own horn. My friend and colleague and I have a book written for elementary aged kids with ADHD to explain the diagnosis with sort of a, you know, here are things that are harder, here are strengths, here's what we can do about those things kind of approach. It's called Different Thinkers ADHD. There are a number of books out there for kids that are focused on specific characteristics or traits. There's an author called Julia Cook who has a number of books on, you know, like personal space or my mouth is a volcano or, you know, like just different sorts of impulse control type issues and the narrative of how the character sort of, you know, learns to manage the issue. There's something called the Thriving with ADHD workbook that I like that has different sorts of little activities and exercises that kids can do. And then there are lots of great, there's something called the Amazing Things Project. If you look on YouTube, they have videos on ADHD, autism, different things that are really well put together for children and providing sort of a overview. And there are also sorts of similar things you can find that are more targeted for teens. And then I'll say one last thing and then let Jesse weigh in. But I also like Jessica McCabe's YouTube channel, How to ADHD, which has a lot of very like engaging, accessible videos on ADHD, executive functioning, etc.
Yeah, I recommend that to adults. And just to throw in my 2 cents, my top book that I recommend is Taking Charge of Adult ADHD by Barkley, who Dr. Fredriksen
Mm.
mentioned earlier. So he's
And
kind
he
of,
has great YouTube videos.
oh yes, right.
Like
you
if
said,
you're not
yeah.
the kind of person who wants to wade through a book,
Mhm.
he and another prominent ADHD researcher, Thomas Brown, who I like, they have good, accessible, sort of, not too long and wordy videos.
Mhm.
I also like Joel Niggs getting ahead of ADHD.
Yes, me too.
I think that's a good one. Those were all really good suggestions. And someone's asking,
I'm writing.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys gave some good resources. I love all those that you've listed. Um, okay. I mean, I think I got most of the questions in here. Was there anything? Oh, here's another question. Any impulse control books specifically regarding impulse control that you'd recommend for preteens or teens?
Oh, preteens or teens.
There's your next book, Katia.
Well. Thank you for that. I'm not sure about that. There are books about, no, not for that age range that I can think of. More sort of like later elementary or earlier elementary. I'm sure it's out there. I'm just not aware of it.
Dr. Brand, any other book recommendations from you about ADHD
Well,
related to
I was
ADHD?
going to mention possibly for women specifically, I think it's called Understanding ADHD in Women. It's by Kathleen Nadeau.
Yes. I'm also putting Raising a Girl with ADHD. I really like that. And it's short and not like a big tome, but also really useful. I'm just putting some of those things in the chat. Yeah, there's so much stuff out there. It's just wading through to find what's like accessible and,
What's actually helpful.
Yeah, exactly. And what's not too overwhelming that you get the book and you just look at it and you think, oh my God, I'm never going to read that.
Mhm.